First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming and to this Campbell lecture regarding the future of the Republican Party. And I want to thank you for coming on time. You were a very, very prompt group. I don't know if that has anything to do with the subject matter at hand, but and I also want to thank the group because I recognize that titles with the word Republican in their branding may not necessarily be the most popular thing on campus these days. So I thank you and applaud you for your curiosity and your openness in coming. I also want to thank my friend and my Campbell Institute colleague, Professor Peggy Thompson, for bringing Mac Stipanovich here to share his thoughts with us, and she'll have more to say about Mac in a minute, and she is also going to provide a brief response to Mac's comments before we move to the Q&A part. I also want to thank Kelly Coleman and the Campbell Institute, who worked the logistics of organizing Mac's visit, and Tom Fazio and the rest of the IT crew for helping and creating an archive of it. First of all, let me just take a minute to ask you to turn off or silence your cell phones. And I'm going to wait for Lewis to do that. He could be a repeat offender. He might be a repeat offender. So let me just say one thing about the topic before I turn it over to Peggy to say more about Mac. And looking around the room and seeing the faces, I'm pretty confident in the supposition that I'm starting with here. I think many in this room are concerned about the future of progressive and democratic values and policy positions in our nation, and rightly so. And if that's you, you should be concerned about what is happening and what will happen in the Republican Party. I don't need to remind the group that the Republican Party now has control of the presidency and the Congress, and a majority of the state legislatures, and a majority of the governorships. So in the short term, at least, what happens in the Republican Party may matter more than anything else for the preservation of those values and policies. And should, down the road, the Republican Party return to the loyal opposition, the composition and the direction of that opposition will again matter a lot. So, Mac, on behalf of all of us, I know that we are very keen to hear what you have to say today. And so, Peggy, I just want to thank you again for bringing Mac here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's good to see so many people I know and so many people I don't yet know. Mac Stipanovich has been a Republican activist in the state of Florida for over 30 years now, I believe. He is from Williston, Florida, one of the great metropoli of Central Florida, and is a graduate of Gainesville High School, the University of Florida, and the University of Florida School of Law. He served as a Marine in Vietnam. He was Chief of Staff to Governor Bob Martinez. He worked for Governor Charlie Crist, and he has worked in a variety of capacities with the Bush family, most notably in the endless 2000 election, when he served as an advisor to the Bush campaign and to Secretary of State Katherine Harris. If you have questions about that, feel free to bring them up during the Q&A. This election cycle, Mac has been a leading voice and an outspoken voice, and one that continues to be heard in what has become known as the Never Trump movement. As an ardent and committed Republican, he has a lot to say about what has happened to his party in this election cycle and what the implications of that are for civil government and for the future of American politics. Mac is also a lobbyist. As somebody who's written a book on lobbying, I see that as a plus. And Mac and I were in high school together. So it's good to have the opportunity for this reunion. And I will say, I think you will be impressed by his style of presentation. I like to believe that at least some of that has to do with the early training he received from at least one high school English teacher who was my mother. And so she saw things in Mac that at the time maybe not a whole lot of people saw yet. And I think you will understand what I mean. I'm very, very happy to introduce Mac Stipanovich to you today.
First, we're going to have to do some housekeeping. I did advise Catherine Harrison to recount. I've never admitted that I was in touch with the Bush campaign, and I don't intend to admit it today. Peggy's right. We went to high school together. Her mother was my favorite teacher of all time. She's one of the 3 most distinguished graduates of Gainesville High at about the time I was there. The other 2 being Don Felder of the Eagles and Tom Petty. So she's in distinguished company. I noticed earlier when I came up here that this podium height is right in the gray area between wear my glasses and don't wear my glasses. So you may see me take them on and off. It's not an affectation, it's me trying to see. And while it's probably bad form to apologize in advance, I'm much more experienced in writing speeches than I am at delivering them, as you will soon find out. The last 12 months have been full of surprises for me. One of them's being here. Syracuse is a long way from Tallahassee, and this audience is a far cry from the usual suspects on the dock in Destin where I keep my boat. And going back to the makeup of the audience, this is probably one of the few places in America where I might be welcome, so I appreciate you having me here. A second surprise this year.
I think is it this mic? Which mic should be? If we can make it a little louder. Thank you.
A second that's louder. A second pleasant surprise for me this year was Clemson beating Auburn. As I've said, we're from Gainesville, so I'm a lifelong Gator and an SEC guy, but there are limits to my tribal loyalties, as you're about to find out, and Lou Saban and the Tide dwell on the far side of those limits. But the biggest surprise for me in the last year, a surprise so shocking and so dismaying that I may never recover from it, truly, was Donald Trump winning the Republican nomination for president. A man who's changed his party registration 5 times since 1987, was a Democrat just 8 years ago, a man who's no more conservative or Republican than the Visigoths were Romans, won my party's nomination in pretty much the same way that they made their way to the Forum. And then to add ultimate insult to grievous injury, damn if you didn't win the election, which, like I said, just dumbfounded me. He lost the popular vote by a healthy 3 million vote margin. And just a switch of 40,000 votes in 3 states, he would have lost the Electoral College too. You know, when you hear, like Jeb lost to Lawton Chiles in a gubernatorial race in Florida by 63,000 votes back in 94, I think. Well, you think, damn, you only lost by 63,000 votes. No, he only lost by 32,000 votes. Only 32,000 of those 63 had to change their minds. And you would, now I was beaten by Lawton Chiles. Hell, I was beaten 55-45 in 1990. When you lose by that much, you can go to sleep like a dog because there's nothing you could have done. When you lose by 32,000 votes, you may never sleep again because anything you might have done could have made a difference. Reminds me of John McCain. No, it was Bob Dole said that after the New Hampshire primary, he slept like a baby. Slept for 2 hours, woke up, cried, fell back asleep, slept like a baby. So how could this happen? It may be impossible to arrive at a definitive answer to this question because the moving pieces in this election dynamic were so many their relative importance so hard to evaluate, and the nature of their interplay so subtle. But we need to try to understand if we're going to be able to do anything about it in the future. So we synthesize and we generalize, hoping that as a result, we can at least find some truth dimly seen rather than it all being lost in the welter of polling before and after and all the analyses since that are, very tendentious for one side or the other. We need to try to decide and see what happened, and that's a little bit what I'm trying to talk about today. I want to do a little of that synthesizing and generalizing after my own fashion. I can't lay claim to the insights that result from a lifetime of study and research and thought as many of you can, but I can offer a view of events seen through the prism of 30 years of hands-on political experience in the ever-critical purple state of Florida. This experience, however, is bolstered by the scholarship and thinking of folks with better minds than my own, and I have Monica Crowley in mind here, by the way, about what I'm about to do. And I want to acknowledge these debts proactively so that I don't get ridden out of Syracuse on a rail, tarred and feathered, accused of plagiarism. I tip my hat to Richard Hofstadter for almost everything he wrote. On the lineage and lineaments of fascism, I'm in the debt of Robert O. Paxton, Stanley G. Payne, and Roger B. Griffin. I've noticed, by the way, and I talked about this to Margaret Susan Thompson, that when you guys write something, you get to be much bigger. I mean, it's Robert O. Paxton. It's not Bob Paxton. I read something in Foreign Affairs a while ago by William Russell Meade. If I ever write anything, I'm going to change my name. I told Peggy to like Algernon Q. Braithwaite or something. So. When it comes to populism in America, I've cribbed from Michael Kazin, John Judas, and Jan Werner Muller. For a little cultural seasoning to spice up this dry stuff, I turned to J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, like everybody else, Nancy Eisenberg's White Trash, which I would recommend to you, and William Henry's In Defense of Elitism. Those aren't all my mentors, of course, but they're ones I can readily put my finger on in the context of this talk. Just accept my admission, as you're probably also going to notice, that I have a first-rate, second-class mind, and I'm unburdened by many original thoughts. What was it? Wasn't it Oliver Wendell Holmes that said of Roosevelt that he had a second-class mind but a first-rate temperament, something to that effect? Well, that's kind of like my mind, several steps down. Before getting to the meat of what I want to say, I have to make another confession. I cannot abide Donald Trump. It's not the policies, some of which I like, some of which I can countenance, and some of which I vehemently oppose. It's the man, it's Donald Trump. I dislike him so much that it undoubtedly clouds my judgment. He's an ignorant, crude, narcissistic, name-calling bully. If he and I were in the 5th grade together, I'd fight him at least once a week. And my father would buy me ice cream. Now, I know this because my father, who lives in a double wide down in Williston, I asked him about it, and he said, go ahead and fight him, son. I'll buy you some ice cream. Now, he's taller than me and outweighs me. I don't care what he says. He outweighs me by an easy 20 pounds. If there's any among you who admire Donald Trump, the man who wants to be like him, who would want your children to grow up to be him, we're unlikely to be friends. With that caveat, I want to divide the election into 2 parts. The Republican primary and the general election, because I think the dynamics were very different between the two. They overlapped, they were related, but they were very different. My focus is going to be on the Republican primaries and what the outcome may mean for the party going forward. On that topic, my opinions will have the firmer foundation of the experience of which I spoke earlier. But later we can also discuss the general election, the Democratic Party. See, I made a mistake. Democratic Party. I said Democratic Party, which is its actual name. Republicans don't say Democratic Party. We're Democratic Party. We say Democrat Party. And look, I've already made a mistake, and I'm only on page 8. So anyway, we can talk about those things later because ignorance has never been an impediment for me having an opinion about anything. As we slip into the primaries, I want you to think of the Republican Party as a Venn diagram depicting its various factions. The boundaries of those circles are indistinct and they're porous, and they change in size with changing events. They're status quo conservatives, conservative reformers, religious conservatives, foreign policy hawks, isolationists, libertarians, modern Tories, notional Whigs. There's a gracious plenty of right-wing populists. And yes, Virginia, we've got more than our fair share of neo-fascists. I'm a Tory, although much disappointed in the new king. I'm more status quo than reformer, much more Edmund Burke and William Buckley than Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller. Jeb Bush is in the intersection of conservative reformers and religious conservatives. Ted Cruz has set up shop in the intersection of religious conservatives and right-wing populists. And Donald Trump has one foot in the circle of right-wing populists and the other in the circle of neo-fascism. And that's where the Trump base lies, among the right-wing populists and neo-fascists in the Republican Party, who comprise a minority, believe it or not, although a very large minority, of the GOP. Now, I don't believe that Donald Trump or his base in the Republican Party are fascists in the literal historic sense, any more than I believe that their opposite numbers on the left are totalitarians, which is a word that we like to throw live over the fence in the opposite direction. Hyperbole of that kind is seldom helpful in seeing things clearly. The resulting arguments generate more heat than light, and they impede understanding. So I'm going to go far, but I'm not going to go that far. But Trump and a significant number of those in the party who worship him do have undeniable fascist tendencies, which at some point are numerous enough and coherent enough to warrant being called neo-fascism, although it's a relatively weak American strain of the disease. What are those tendencies, those proclivities? Well, let's begin with racially tinged xenophobia. The demonization of the other is characteristic of fascism. In the more anemic American iteration about which the stench of racism hangs in the air, Jews and gypsies have been replaced by Mexicans and Muslims. Trump adamantly maintains he's not a racist, and perhaps he isn't. I won't argue that point. But racists the world over think he's one of them. And his primary campaign was certainly one long dog whistle. In this context, the combination of race and religion is a marker. As Robert O. Paxton wrote presciently in 2007, open quote, an authentically popular American fascism would be pious. Here I think of Donald Trump and his regard for 2 Chronicles. It would be anti-black, and since September 11, anti-Muslim. If Donald Trump doesn't fit this description, however insincerely, many of his Republican supporters do, and they mean it. Then there's the nativism that prefers to be called nationalism. If we had to come up with a catchphrase, a slogan that might capture this inward-looking, exclusionary, and anti-pluralist tendency, what would it be? I would offer you America first. That works on so many levels, including harking back to the slogan that was the slogan of American fascist sympathizers in the 1930s. I see the man in the third row shaking his head. You're going to get your chance. Nativism sets the table for what I believe will be history's verdict on the Trump presidency: reaction at home and retreat abroad. Then there's the heady whiff of violence. The examples of threatened violence and actual violence at his rallies during the campaign are too numerous and too memorable to require listing. In addition, there was the recurring vilification of the press with the accompanying ominous chanting. Always the chanting, lock her up, always kind of got my goat. There was the proposal to torture our enemies and murder their families. I don't know about y'all, but I consider this to be pretty scary stuff, and I generally consider it to be fascist stuff. It's stuff loved by the third of the Republican Party who may, before this is all over, spell its doom. I want to digress in order to illustrate my point about the free zone that violence provides to the far right, even if that violence is theoretical and largely rhetorical at this point. President Trump's renewed dalliance with torture, his public statement that he believes it works and support it, was pure political theater. After the inevitable outcry, he said he would defer to General Mattis on the matter, and Mattis famously opposes torture, which Trump knew well. Adopting torture as an interrogation technique was never a real possibility. It was just red meat intended to signal his core supporters that he remains one of them. Moving down the list of neo-fascist tells, there's the Trump cult of personality. Think back to those campaign rallies, which if not Nuremberg in scale and production values, certainly were in terms of emotion and devotion. Again, I quote Paxton, "Fascist rule is more nakedly dependent on charisma than any other kind." Fascism is also emotive rather than ideological. It has no real intellectual architecture, unlike communism or even liberal democracy. It's ad hoc, focused on politics and popularity rather than on defining principles. I believe I'm on firm ground when I say this is an accurate description of so-called Trumpism, which is a malleable mixture of ideological contradictions and popular appeals. Misogynism. I'll concede that it can be argued plausibly, if not persuasively, that Trump isn't a racist personally. But it's indisputable that he's a misogynist, and any judge in America would take judicial notice of that fact. And Robert O. Griffin, nope, wrong. Robert B. Griffin maintains that inherent in fascism is, and I quote, a radical misogyny or flight from the feminine. Another tendency characteristic of fascism is obviously authoritarianism, the affinity for a strong man, a man on horseback come to save the country, who alone can solve the problems that baffle others, who's strong when others are weak, who's indefatigable when others, like Jeb, have low energy, whose will to win will see us through any crisis, who will our enemies fear more than any other? The only answer is Donald Trump. I alone can do this, he's told you time and time again. In this context, comparisons to Stalin and Hitler and things like that, which people have a tendency to do when they're caught up in the moment, those are ridiculous. They're insupportable slanders, and they don't help at all. But in attitudes and mannerisms, are comparisons to Benito Mussolini and Juan Perón that far afield? I don't think so. In fact, if you look at the pictures, you might think that Trump had conscientiously copied Mussolini's mannerisms. I used to make all my Republican friends mad because I'd post that picture of Mussolini, and I'd post one from Donald Trump's thing, and it would just drive them nuts. They'd be gnawing on me for days. Which brings us to Make America Great Again, the overarching theme of Trump's campaign and of his presidency. Palingenesis, the reactionary looking back to some former greatness, real or imagined, is quintessentially fascist. Quoting Griffin again, fascism is a genus of political ideology whose mythic core, in its various permutations, is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. Isaiah Berlin said of Franklin Roosevelt that his greatest strength was that he didn't fear the future, that he believed that whatever tomorrow might bring, he could convert to grist for his mill. This embrace of the future and its possibilities is not a strength shared by a substantial part of the Republican Party or its current champion. Rather, the opposite is true. I want to say again that I don't believe Donald Trump or his core supporters in the GOP are actual fascists. There are just too many elements missing to make a strict comparison apt. The Republicans of whom I speak tend to be isolationists rather than expansionists. Trumpism is not a civic religion, at least not yet, and the violence on which fascism feeds is implied, not actual, at least so far. And there are no party military and police forces parallel to the traditional institutions. So as much as you'd like to head that way, if you really dislike Donald Trump, as we say in Williston, that dog won't hunt. So how can these folks best be characterized? They're populist, radical right-wing populist, infused with the fascist tendencies I've highlighted. So let's talk about populism for a little bit. Donald Trump certainly isn't the first demagogue to ride a wave of populism out of major economic or social dislocations in America. Surges of populism have been a recurring phenomenon in American history. Some would trace Trump's populist lineage all the way back to Jefferson and Jackson. But that stretches it a little far for me. The parallels to Jackson are actually pretty good, but I'm just not going to give him that, mostly out of spite. But late in the 19th century, the spore of the American populace becomes pretty easy to see, and you can follow it directly to today. Donald Trump is William Jennings Bryan, if Bryan spoke gibberish. He's Father Charles Coughlin, if the radio priest never asked for God's forgiveness. He's Huey Long with bad hair. He's George Wallace with a jet. He's not even the first billionaire champion of the common man. That distinction goes to Ross Perot. Trump's distinction is that he won where his forebears failed. And the major difference between him and them is that he hijacked a major political party rather than mounting a quixotic and futile bid for the presidency. His genius, and in this regard he's a genius, is that he saw that he could capture the Republican Party with the rabid support of a fifth column that's been there waiting for this moment since World War II. The fifth column has gone by many names and taken different forms. It was the John Birch Society and the acolytes of Joseph McCarthy back in the good old days when we were frightened of communists under our beds rather than foreigners pouring over our borders to steal our jobs, rape our women, and kill us at the mall. There were movement conservatives, religious conservatives, the silent majority, middle America, and the Tea Party before there was the refurbished and renamed Trump movement. Historically, at least in Florida, these folks have been a large but manageable minority in the party, 25 to 35%, depending on the year and the circumstances. I want to pause again and make it clear that I'm talking about a generalized voter type in the GOP who was an easy mark for Trump's demagoguery. Not every Republican Trump voter, even in the primaries, much less in the general election, is a right-wing populist. And while most, if not all, right-wing populists share most, if not all, of the characteristics I'm going to describe, they possess them in differing degrees. I remind you that I'm trying to synthesize and generalize in an attempt to find some useful truths scattered in the still smoking wreckage of the pre-Trump Republican Party. Prior to World War II, American populism was generally found on the left of the political spectrum and was a two-part dynamic. It pitted the people against the elite, the populares versus the optimatus, Marius and Sulla, Caesar and Brutus. Right-wing populism raised its ugly head after World War II, initially fueled by the Red Scare. Right-wing populism has three moving pieces rather than two, and it's even more rife with class resentment. An indefined, actually undefinable middle class of so-called average Americans, common people, real Americans, working people, is pinched by between a rapacious elite class above and an insatiable lower class below. The elite, Wall Street investment bankers, global corporate moguls, smug, overeducated intellectuals, exploit real Americans for their own selfish benefit and for the benefit of a shiftless, undeserving, and even dangerous rabble, like illegal immigrants, Sharia law-loving foreigners, and black folks who do nothing but complain. The real contributors in this country are beleaguered fore and aft. As a result, anger, envy, and angst are the common currency of right-wing populists. And as Hofstadter pointed out in his seminal essay, right-wing populism is paranoia on steroids. No conspiracy, no cabal of international bankers, Wall Street financiers, one-world advocates, and terrorist fellow travelers is too far-fetched to be believed. I got a haircut last week, so that'd be pretty when I came up here. I think I look pretty good. Huh? The three chairs in the main room of the barbershop are manned by women, one of whom has been trimming my wig for a decade. But in the back's a smaller room, where a crusty old male barber, crustier and even older than I am, holds court with his customers. While I was getting my hair cut, he and two or three like-minded right-wing populists were discussing how many people Bill and Hillary Clinton have had murdered over the years to further their political careers. Y'all can correct me, but I believe the number's 52. And they were ticking off the names of the victims and the motives for their murders. Now, these are grown damn men, mind you, walking around in broad daylight, unescorted by professional caregivers. And every one of them is a Republican Trump voter. Worse, an elected official in Florida, whose name I was actually going to use until I found out it was going to be taped, obliquely referenced the Clinton murder myth not long ago on Facebook. And the reference wasn't all that oblique. It's enough to make a sane man weep. You can think what you want to about the Clintons, and I don't think much of them. But to think that they had 52 people murdered is insane. Literally insane. Needless to say, the boys in the barbershop are anti-intellectual, and as are most right-wing populists. While they value the kind of instrumental intelligence that demonstrates its value in the workplace, they're innately suspicious of abstractions, of learning for learning's sake, and of expertise and experience beyond their kin. A right-wing populist believes, as an article of faith, that there's nothing that a career public servant, weighted down with postgraduate degrees, steeped in experience and distinguished by achievement, can do that a successful businessman with good old American common sense can't do as well or better. Think otherwise is elitist, and it's un-American. Right-wing populism is also anti-pluralist. This is best illustrated by another one of my favorite phrases, real Americans. Real Americans look like them, think like them, and share their values. Anyone else is illegitimate, beyond the pale, excluded from the charmed circle of American authenticity. And this is true even if your ancestors arrived on the Mayflower. If you're out of step, you're not the real deal. Probably not a patriot, perhaps a traitor. Dwight Eisenhower, he was a closet communist. John Kennedy, a effete, Harvard-educated liberal with a suspicious affinity for black people. John Kerry, Silver Star winner, ISIS enabler. There's not a real American among them. The Weltanschauung of right-wing populism is Manichaean and apocalyptic. There are only two choices, their way or the highway. Their way is right, good, and American. The highway is wrong, pernicious, and evil. And while their way leads to renewal and glory with a chicken in every pot, like my long illusion, and a bass boat in every garage, the highway is the road to perdition, to disaster, to end times. A former statewide elected official, whose name I also took out of this presentation when I found it was being taped, told me before the election that the Republic literally wouldn't survive 4 years of Hillary Clinton in the White House. He didn't mean that things would deteriorate, that things would be worse. He meant the Republic wouldn't survive. He appeared to believe that ISIS terrorists secreted in waves of Syrian refugees would kill at will, and Sharia law would spread from Minnesota. For some reason, Sharia law is apparently a really big thing in Minnesota, and blanket the country, excepting, of course, those regions that would be controlled by murderous Mexican drug cartels. The spread of Sharia law and the roving gangs of drug-crazed Mexican rapists point up another aspect of right-wing populism. It's indifferent to the truth, oblivious to probabilities, and contemptuous of evidence. I call it willful ignorance. But I believe the newly minted term is alternative facts. Consider Trump's alleged landslide victory and the mandate he and his voters want you to believe he received. The facts are that he was soundly defeated in the popular vote, and the margin of his electoral college victory ranks 36th out of all 58 presidential elections, and 13th out of the 18 since World War II. But you'd be better off talking to a stump than trying to tell a Trump-supporting right-wing populist that his victory was a narrow one, a close-run thing. That's just fake news. Hell, show them two photographs taken from the identical spot at the same time of day of the crowds at Trump's inauguration and Obama's inauguration, and they won't even believe their own lying eyes. So what do we have? We have a substantial part of the GOP that is, to a greater or less extent, xenophobic with a tinge of racism, nativist, cultist, non-ideological, which, by the way, I would go with unprincipled, but non-ideological. This is a college audience, this is a much bigger word, so I decided to use it. and my assistant somewhere in this little talk wanted me to use the word gobsmacked, so consider it done, and I'll report it to her. Misogynist, authoritarian, reactionary, paranoid, anti-intellectual, anti-pluralist, Manichaean, apocalyptic, and gullible. If this laundry list sounds overwrought, unfair, and implausible to you, just the bitter complaints of an old man whose time has passed and won't let it go, then you need to get out more. The folks I'm describing not only exist, hell, I'm related in the second degree to some of them, and some of my colleagues in my law firm. For the third time, and for my own safety, and I've got my eye on the guy with the big arms there, I want to make clear to the outraged among you what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that every Trump supporter is a right-wing populist. I'm not saying that every right-wing populist, or even any right-wing populist, fits the profile I've described perfectly. What I am saying is that within the Venn diagram that is the Republican Party, there are two overlapping circles, circumscribed by the aggregate of characteristics I have described, and they're a substantial minority in the Republican Party. So what's to be done about this fifth column of radicals in the GOP? The answer is fight, resist. You can't reason with Birchers and Bannons. They can only be contained, and then they must be defeated. Historically in Florida, containment was the rule. In 2006, the now infamous Republican Benedict Arnold, Charlie Crist, faced off against Tom Gallagher in the Republican gubernatorial primary. Gallagher, traditionally a center-right legislator, had reinvented himself as a hard-right ideologue of the religious right flavor, putting Crist on his left, and in some people thought, danger in a primary. The incentive for Crist to move right, to minimize his risk in the primary, was powerful. But I argued to him that getting to the right of Gallagher in the primary would leave him too far from the center to win the general election in a closely divided state. I advised him not to eat the poison candy of extremism, and he didn't. And he went on to win the primary 65-35. There's that 35% again, and went on to be elected governor easily. But that was 10 years ago. In the interim, the economic stress of the Great Recession, the perceived failure of President Obama's foreign policy, the cultural dislocations like the jailbreak that was the triumph of gay marriage, and the ever-present issue of race has shifted the entire party to the right. Even so, had there not been 17 candidates in the initial presidential field, a Jeb Bush, a Marco Rubio, or a John Kasich might have prevailed. But with 15 or 16 qualified candidates ranged along the political spectrum, dividing up the more mainstream vote, the candidate who was reckless enough and shameless enough to open Pandora's box and summon the extremist demons in the party to his side was, with his plurality, king. Keep in mind that Donald Trump had not received anything close to a majority of the Republican primary vote when Ted Cruz dropped out after Indiana. In fact, the number was less than 42%. The right-wing populist third of the party, swollen to 40% by the recession, reaction against the Obama administration, and Hillary hatred, is what propelled Trump to the nomination. Not necessarily what propelled him to the White House, although that's part of it, but to the nomination. In the general election, the Obama-Clinton boogeyman, plus muscle reflex when pulling the lever in the voting booth, brought the party home to a man who, as I've said before, is neither Republican nor conservative. And now the party's heavily invested in him. To not coin a phrase, nothing succeeds like success. So what does this mean for the future? Well, the answer depends on the extent to which mainstream Republicans actually care about conservative principles. If their historical opposition to big spending, big government, and big deficits is more than rhetoric, then they can't support Trump's Keynesian economic agenda over the long term. If they believe in competition and free trade, then they can't support Trump's protectionist agenda over the long term. If they believe in American exceptionalism, that we are and should remain the dominant player on the international stage, then they can't support Trump's isolationist agenda over the long term. If they believe in the Constitution and the values that did in fact make this country great, then they won't be able to support Trump's authoritarian, anti-immigrant, anti-pluralist, anti-free press agenda. The answer does not depend on the leadership, the elected leadership of the Republican Party. By and large, no help can be expected from this quarter. Most of the elected Republicans with whom I've spoken privately acknowledge that Trump is a buffoon, but they fear radicals coming after them in their primaries, so they remain silent. There are exceptions to this rule at the national level: John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Susan Collins, Ben Sasse, John Kasich, Jeff Flake in Arizona. But the rule is self-preservation. I don't know of a single elected official at the state level in Florida who has publicly disagreed with Donald Trump on anything since Election Day, and God knows they've had ample opportunities to do so. If it turns out that rank-and-file Republicans care more about that chicken in their pot and that bass boat in their garage than they care about principle, and that their elected leaders care more about winning at any cost than they do about being right, which may sound kind of Pollyanna-ish, but, you know, there are moments when you're supposed to. This is what I told Catherine during the recount. Politicians prepare for that moment. You know, they all convince themselves that when that moment comes, when they can make a difference, that they'll step up. But that moment is always further down the road, and it's important that they remain in office preparing for that moment when it comes. I told Catherine during the recount, this is it. This is your moment. For elected Republicans, this is that moment, in my judgment. And the ones who fail the test, shame on them. Shame on them. So, if nobody's going to step up, folks can't find their principles, then probably only misfortune can discredit Trump and put right-wing radicalism back in the box. A shooting war with China, God forbid, a trade war with the world, a face plan on repealing Obamacare, which I think is, if not probable, certainly possible. Federal agents forcing their way into some of the myriad of churches Peggy showed me today and dragging out immigrant women and children being sheltered by nuns who resist. Russian incursions into the Baltic states, or God willing, enough exposure to a President Trump to finally trigger their gag reflex. But absent an onset of principles, an upwelling of elected leadership, or shared misfortune, the party will be permanently deformed by Donald Trump and the Trump knockoffs who are now pawing the turf in the 2018 primary starting gates. And true conservatives will have to decide whether to leave a party, the philosophy of which is unacceptable and the leadership of which is unendurable, or to fight on. Some of my friends and thought leaders of note have already left the party. Sally Bradshaw in Florida, who was Jeb's chief strategist. Mary Madeline, who once described herself as memorably as a Bush liege woman. George Will. But I remain undaunted for now. There are another couple of rounds left in me. And I intend to continue answering the bell by opposing many Trumps in the 2018 primaries and in the general election if necessary. And by posting up on the man himself again in 2020 if he manages to avoid being impeached and seeks re-election. If the only things my grandchildren remember about me when I'm gone, other than that I always bought them ice cream after school on Fridays, is that I publicly opposed the Iraq War before the first shot was fired, and that I saw Donald Trump and his myrmidons for what they were, and I resisted, then I'll be content. In closing, I thank you again for giving me the opportunity to do a little of that resisting this far north of the Mason-Dixon line.
So I just have a couple of questions to ask Mac, and then we're going to open it up to all of you because I'm sure that you have a lot that you want to say as well. I guess my first question, and it's a big one, so this may be the only one I ask, is what you see as the possibility for cooperation between what I would like to call thoughtful Republicans like yourself and like some people I see in this room, and Democrats. In 2013, after the defeat of Mitt Romney, the Republican Party famously conducted a self-study and said we need to be more open to minorities, to women, to population groups who have not recently been attracted to our message. Obviously, that's not what happened in 2016. So I'm wondering, when you talk about the future of the Republican Party, what does that involve, and is there ground that you perceive for cooperation between never-Trump Republicans and Democrats?
I doubt there will be any cooperation in the sense of communication and coordination and those sorts of things. That's, the idea of me sitting down at a table with Debbie Wasserman Schultz and talking about what's next. I'll just soon crawl in a bathtub and drink a glass of wine and open a vein. But cooperation in the sense of independently moving in the same direction with the same ultimate purpose, I think that's quite possible. I mean, you can have numerous examples in history of where two natural enemies fought a common enemy and then returned to their former allegiances once the danger was gone. I think it's more likely that right now, until Trump's performance reduces right-wing populism in the party back to that 25 to 35%, the mission I'm on is a quixotic one. All we can do is nip at his heels, bay at him like dogs after a big stag. We try to bleed him, nick him, keep him from getting any momentum, keep him from getting his feet under him, wear him down, but we can't knock him out. Our two greatest allies are time and Donald Trump. On the other side of the aisle, you guys are going to have to or you guys being the Democrats in the room, are going to have to decide what you're about. The only way those public officials I described before are going to change their behavior and step up is if it's more costly to have their legs wrapped around Donald Trump than it is not to, which goes to Republican primaries and goes ultimately to winning elections. So let's take an election in a red state, or let's take an election in a purple state. You get a Trump mini-me who wins the nomination, despite the best efforts of mainstream Republicans to prevent it. And there aren't many that are going to step up. My wife begged me every morning before I shave, will you shut up? You're driving me crazy. You're driving everybody you know crazy. This is getting to be embarrassing. But so far, I refuse to shut up. You're going to have to beat them in general elections. And they're going to have to figure out, like I was talking about with Charlie Crist earlier, that you cannot stray too far from the center and survive. So the folks who get that far to the right in a Republican primary, y'all got to hammer them in general elections. When a couple of high-profile people lose general elections, who are Trump mini-me's, in the next election cycle, you'll see the nominees are closer to the center. And there's that 40, 42, 43, 45%, which may even be a majority in a red state primary, will be not so formidable, and they can be defied. But that's going to take several election cycles. This is not the work of a day. I mean, there's no magic to be performed here that's going to change it. It's going to be a long, hard slog, a war of attrition. Elections will be won, elections will be lost, but you're going to have to move the risk and rewards to change behavior.
I have one more question, then we'll open it up, I promise. And this is, I'm going to ask you to put on the hat you wore before 1986 and pretend that you're a Democrat.
That would have been 70s, but go ahead.
Okay, 70s, whatever. I'm asking you to do that. And who do you see as potential challengers in 2020, potential future party leaders or stars in the Democratic Party? As we move down, there's been a lot of talk about there's a thin bench and all of that, but are there people that you see who could step forward or who are on the road to being able to take a leadership role in the Democratic Party? And then it's up to you all for the rest of the
You
question.
know, I'm not sure that I know enough about the Democrat Party to answer that, so I want to answer it by analogy. In the Republican Party, of those I named who have mounted a fairly consistent principled resistance to Trump when he goes slap crazy, are older politicians like John McCain or even Lindsey Graham. They just been there long enough that by God, they're not going to take it. There is a group of younger people like Ben Sasse from Nebraska and Jeff Flake from Arizona, and folks like that, the governor in New Mexico and all, who appear to have enough sense to come in out of the rain, and I think, and have been fairly principled. They're not dirty. They haven't bear hugged Trump, and they might be our future. Who those people are in the Democrat Party, I don't know. But and see, the Democrat Party faces an interesting choice too. As you pointed out, when we did the autopsy after 2012, the decision overseen by Rance Primus, No? Okay, I know who it is.
You know who he is.
Was to broaden the party's appeal, to be more welcoming to Hispanics, to emphasize inclusivity. And that's what many of the 17 candidates in that field appeared to be trying to do in the beginning. But Trump doubled down on crazy. And that had always been really the right wing's argument, that it wasn't that Romney and McCain were too crazy to be elected. They weren't crazy enough. And even though the underlying facts are different, and I think I don't know that you can draw valid generalizations, it appears to have been right. So with respect to the Democrat Party, what are y'all going to do? Are you going to tap brakes on some of that social justice stuff that drives the people in Des Moines crazy and drives those laid off auto workers outside of Detroit crazy? Or are you going to double down and just rely on demographics to eventually win the day for you? Now, I think you may have some mistaken assumptions if you're going to rely on demographics, like the assumption that Hispanics, as if that was one type of person, are going to just fall into your lap like ripe fruit. I don't know that's the case at all. Depending on what Trump and the people who advise him and Republican Party leaders separate from Trump devise to offer those various constituencies, you may find that what you're counting on is not there. He's already undermining the base of your fortress with protectionism. I mean, hell, if you want to talk about trade and economics, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between your left wing and him in a debate. And so, are y'all going to modify your position, try to allay the fears of people who are afraid that their way of life and their values are being thrown under the bus by this fabled elite, by the future? I don't know. It's going to be interesting, but you're going to keep losing if you don't come up with something and stick to it. Don't underestimate these people. Peggy and I have had this article before. People act like Northern European white folk came to be on top of the food chain by accident. They just went through a door one day and that's not how they got there. They're hard-nosed, intelligent, willing to pull at the other folks. You're not going to beat them waiting for them to wander off and get another beer while you win the election. So y'all going to have to figure out how you get there. We'll try to hold them like a catch dog. We'll grab him by the tendon and hold on as long as we can, but y'all are going to have to beat him.
We've got two people who are going to be available with microphones, Brandon and Emily, I think, maybe not, doesn't matter. And if you have a question, please wait for the microphone before you proceed so that we can hear you and so that it can be recorded.
How are you?
I'm old, dude.
When you spoke to my class last semester, you had told us that you were unsure of your future with the Republican Party, if you were gonna maybe venture a different direction, or what your opinions would be going forward. What made you make the decision to keep fighting and keep having that stance that you do?
I would like to tell you, in the hopes that I would impress you, that it was my deep, abiding principle, my refusal to be defeated, to be undaunted. Probably as much as anything else, it is inertia. That's where I've been this whole time. And if you want me out, you're going to have to throw my ass out.
I just have a question about how the Democrats can word their fight against Trump, and you yourself call these people ignorant, but how can Democrats try to win these people over without sounding condescending if they are ignorant?
Well, you got to remember who you're talking to. As I said earlier, you're not going to convince that 35%. They're going to be there. What you have to do, and it's a two-part process, you have to beat right-wing extremists in general elections until they move closer to the center in their primaries and bring with them that portion of the Republican Party who used to be a majority who isn't crazy. You're not going to convince the guys in that barber shop. Don't waste your breath. They're gone. And that's one of the scariest things about this. I always knew that they were there. Over my career, I've exploited them. I've won elections with them. It's like, feeding a tiger. And the tiger got loose. And now we've got to catch him up and put him back in the cage. And it's scary. The country is deeply divided. And I assume all of y'all know this, but if you don't know how divided and how serious people on both sides are. I mean, there are people in the Democrat Party just as crazy as those guys in the barbershop, I promise you. I don't know how we're going to fix it, but we've got to reestablish some sort of center. There's some famous poet, I can't remember whether it's Houseman or whoever it was, that said the center won't hold. We've got to reestablish a center.
If I'm first, I'm showing my total inability.
We can't hear you.
I think it's on. Just put it up. Put it up. Put your mouth. It's good to go.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's right. I was feeling real proud that I could hear you at my age without the damn microphone. Go ahead.
And I'm thankful I can still talk. I was listening this morning to Congresswoman Maxine Waters talking about her view of the end game. How do we solve this terrible problem that I think she was saying is getting worse by the day? So we've got to do something. And her watchword, she says, going forward for the Democratic Party is impeachment. Now, I don't think I heard you use that word or to talk about that kind of hard work. I heard you talking about good Republican candidates who will bring people back toward the center. All that to a stumbling political science student 50 years ago. That was me. I thought that sounded pretty good. Today, I'm not hearing people embrace that as warmly as they did certainly 50 years ago, and as I would think they would, some of them would now.
Here's kind of what I think about that. I know that people like to talk about impeachment. It's certainly conceivable, if you looked at what's happened in the last 3 weeks, that the president could make some terrible mistake that could result in his impeachment and possibly in his conviction. But if you think about the makeup of the House of Representatives, it'd have to be a god-awful mistake. So I wouldn't count on that. And I will tell you something else. If we're talking about that guy on the bar stool in Dubuque knocking back a Boilermaker, don't send Maxine Waters. Okay? I'm gonna give you my impression. She may be your sister-in-law. Well, Maxine Waters is crazy as a sprayed roach too. So, y'all gonna have to figure out who's gonna speak for you and how they're gonna present. I think everybody in us, and like I said, I'll use Ben Sassigan as an example. He seems like a good, solid guy, young fella. I don't know who your people are, but I think you need different spokespeople. Everybody's worn out. I've read a bunch of different things that I wasn't able to talk about here today. If it weren't for the fact that I'm supposed to know the answers, instead of giving you a reading list, I would tell you a couple of things I'd recommend that particularly the students read. But there are really authoritarians who are intolerant of difference. And they're the people I'm basically talking about. And then there are status quo conservatives, of which I'd be one, who are intolerant of change. They only coalesce and become tremendously powerful and possibly toxic when they're both frightened. And that usually happens when there's been a loss of confidence in the leadership. That the status quo folks think that there's not sufficient constraints, that the system's not working to manage and modulate the rate of change. And the authoritarians, when they'll countenance any amount of change at any pace, as long as it's toward unity and homogeneity. And if you can separate the authoritarians from the status quo and laissez-faire conservatives, you'll get them back in the box. There's a really good book by a woman named Karen Stenner called The Authoritarian Dynamic. It was published in 2005. So it was before Obama and it was before Trump, and it's really kind of eerie talking about this kind of thing. Now, for you younger folks, I don't want to disrespect you, but it gave me a headache. I mean, there's like graphs and there's axes and there's coefficients and covariables. I mean, it's an academic piece of work, so I just skimmed by and read the words. But it's worth the read, and it's a different look at the kind of things you're talking about. I don't think I answered your question, but it sounded good. I mean,
I just want to point out that Max Stepanovich talks a good game, but in his spare time around the year 2000, Mac decided for fun to pursue a master's degree in medieval history. Now, he did not finish this degree, but the fact that somebody would pursue this for fun suggests that he's not quite so much
I was close.
of a backwoods good old boy as he might appear.
I finished the coursework. I took my comps. I got my language requirement out of the way. And at the time, I didn't have a boat, and I didn't have a grandchild. And then at the same time that I was called out of that class for the recount, my wife told me I could buy a new boat. And Dan, my oldest daughter, didn't have a grandchild. And since I had a day job, I never got around to the thesis, so.
Thanks. Just two sort of related things here. First, I have a good friend who woke up one morning in, I think, August to find a big swastika painted on her porch. And that's part of, I think, a really, unfortunately, bigger picture around here. I have other friends who have seen terrible things happen on buses, everything you've heard of. Right. And there are other people around the country who say, oh, none of that's happening. This isn't happening, that's happening. Or they say, oh, well, that was an isolated incident. And if you look at the numbers, not alternative facts, it's just factually not true. There's more. And I think there's more of a middle ground, the center that you talk about. I don't believe that people are really undecided who they would vote for as much. I think there's just people who, I don't want to say can't choose. There's some middle ground that people have to appeal to better. And on the flip side, I've seen a lot of my friends go more towards the fringe sides, left and the right. But I think they're afraid to go to the center too. So I'm wondering what you see about how to convince people, yes, this stuff is happening, even if it's not affecting you, and B, how do we get everybody to appeal to the good common denominator?
I chose to talk today because I'm a Republican about extremists in my party. And I don't mean to imply that all the extremists in this country are found in my party. I don't even know that the majority of extremists in this country are found in my party. And And that's the kind of division that I'm talking about that I think is dangerous. We have a tendency, I think, sometimes to engage in the fallacy of normalcy. That, you know, this is as unpleasant as it is to lose and this and that this is like other elections and we'll get over it. Trump's not that different from Jackson. Really, people were afraid of Reagan. It'll all be all right. I honest to God believe this is different. I believe that we're eroding and undermining the norms of democracy in the country. It's not a particular policy, it's an attitude and it's a kind of behavior. And I find it to be true on the left as well as the right. And keep in mind, when we're going back to the historical fascism and stuff like that, how did it always begin? It always began with fascists fighting socialists and communists in the streets. And it wasn't like one was more virtuous than the other. It was just more that one won and the other one lost. And the same one didn't win everywhere. They didn't win in Russia. So I think your point's well taken. The hardest thing for me is, one, because I'm old and set in my ways, and two, because I have this massive ego, is to listen. As my dinner companions will find out tonight, I'm just not a good listener. I like to talk. But to rebuild that center, all of us are going to have to listen more, and everybody's going to have to give up something. Everybody's going to have to give up something. Yes, sir.
There's somebody with the microphone.
You talked about when you were advising Charlie Crist, and you told him essentially you can't try to win the primary but lose the general election. Mm-hmm. Looking at the Democrats right now, it looks like there's a bit of an issue there as well, because there is a tremendous appetite on the left for, I guess the word would be knee-jerk obstructionism. Almost as soon as Neil Gorsuch was announced as the Supreme Court nominee, some people, I'll use Michael Moore as an example, he said, block Gorsuch or we'll find someone who will. The host of the Young Turks has started his own organization to fund primary challenges to Democrats who they see as unacceptable.
You got to face them down. You got to face them down. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Neil Gorsuch may be way too conservative, even right-wing for many people. What happened to Merrick Garland is tremendously unfair, but it's in the past. Don't fight and die on Gorsuch Hill. You're not going to win. It'll be further divisive. It'll be finding the center. Do something. Call him in front of you, sit him down there, and wear his ass out. And then vote to confirm him if you think he's qualified to be on the Supreme Court. If you have that knee-jerk reaction, you're going to fight him to the death, you're going to skip meetings, you're going to key the cars of the Republican senators, whatever it is, it's just going to keep doing this. We'll never get there. If you didn't like what happened to Merrick Garland, don't do the same thing. Do something different. And make people think, well, that was pretty grown up of them. And so going back to your primaries, we're going to primary you if you don't throw yourself on the Gorsuch grenade. Again, I'm just telling you, this is the time of choosing. This is the time where people who entered politics to make a difference have to decide to make a difference. So they need to throw themselves on that damn grenade.
Hi. So you say that the Republican Party is not racist, xenophobic, sexist, and all these things, but your congressmen, the people that represent them, are becoming overwhelmingly complicit in all these things. You can't find the final person to vote against Betsy DeVos. You have your party has apparently moved or 15% increase in popularity or approval towards the Russians since August.
All right. Oh, that's amazing. That whole deal's amazing. I spent my whole life growing up, I was supposed to hate Russians, and I thought I was going to send my grandchildren to get killed right outside Borodino, but apparently I'm not going to have to now.
Exactly. And you even had congressmen who said that they were going to vote for Trump but would never support the wall, and now you have congressmen talking about how they're going to budget for it. So you're saying, the Republican Party talks a big deal about how they're not all these things, but when it comes down to voting against it, they don't seem to do that.
Well, that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. What I've seen lately is a little bit of rearing up among fiscal conservatives, a little bit of discussion about the wall not being effective, a little bit of discussion about maybe being counterproductive, that it's too expensive, that it's not a national emergency that would enable the president and the Congress to fund it without offsetting budget cuts. It will be interesting to see what Donald Trump actually brings away from the Congress on taking the cap off military spending, $15 billion for a wall, $1 trillion over 10 years for infrastructure, which are really just tax credit for construction companies. We'll see. This goes back to what I said about principles, where the Republican Congress, now they're not going to run out and hold a press conference and say Donald Trump is wrong. I'm not voting for that. They're just going to slow walk it. It's like, you know, when the bouncer in a bar just keeps talking to you, next thing you know, you're in the alley.
Mac knows about that.
Yeah, I've been thrown out of a lot of bars. But so it'll be interesting. We may be entering a period, you know, the federal court's been much maligned until the last couple of weeks, and now I'm mighty proud of them. You might find a dysfunctional Congress that hardly ever gets around to passing anything, not to be such a bad thing for the next year or two. Somebody give this man a microphone, for God's sake.
So I'm just wondering, so there's been like a lot of surveys and polls that said that louder. Okay. So a lot of surveys and polls saying that if just millennials voted, that the United States would be overwhelmingly Democratic. And I think we're seeing less and less Republicans with this like new generation. So I'm just wondering where you see the future of the Republican Party in like millennials and how they might go towards or against Trump.
All right, two things. One is, it's your job, young lady, to remind me not to leave my glasses here. I leave stuff all over the country, and I'm going to go broke eventually buying glasses and new car keys and stuff like that. I'm going to hurt your feelings. Y'all are the sorriest bunch of people when it comes to voting and doing stuff instead of just complaining. There is. I'm told all the time, well, you baby boomers, you ruined the world. I got to live in my mother's basement. What? You know, if you don't want, and I'm not picking on you, if you don't want Donald Trump, go to the polls and vote. If you're satisfied with the way things are, then stay home. I would say the same thing to many black Americans who didn't turn out the way they should have in Broward County in this last election. They turned out for Barack Obama, but they didn't turn out for Hillary Clinton. They may have a good reason not to. But going back to the demographic hammer we were talking a while ago, where all y'all got to do is sit around and wait for people to keep having babies and then the world's going to be glorious, I wouldn't take that to the bank. And I was being too harsh and I was being facetious. And sometimes when I'm facetious, I'm unkind. I think millennials have to figure out what's important. And if politics is important to them, if public policy is important to them, they need to run for office, and they need to go to the polls and vote, and they need to make me worry about them. It goes back to what I was saying about rewards and punishments. If all anybody's going to do is talk, you can talk to your heart's content. I'm not going to do anything for you, really. I mean, you might like to think I'd be nice about it, but I'm not going to be nice about it. He contributes a lot of money. He works in my campaigns. She makes phone calls for me. I'm going to give them what they want. You just keep talking.
Well, I guess I've got the microphone. Am I?
Do not let it go. Just...
Well, you may regret that, because I want to get back to the argument about how this all came about.
Yes.
And how the populists won over and overcame the conservative Republicans.
Right.
And you know, there's a lot of talk out there that the problem here originated in the behavior of the conservative Republicans.
No question.
Their response to Obama's election, their foolishness about closing down the government over a small deficit, their tax policy, lowering taxes without talking in any way about reducing expenditure. So tell us a little how you react to the charge that you know, you did it to yourselves, and we shouldn't be looking to the conservative Republicans to help us deal with Mr. Trump.
Well, you're absolutely right. We're guilty. The Southern strategy, Nixon, the dog whistles, enabling right-wing folks, teaching them that their government is their enemy. Nobody runs to go to Washington to fix a problem. They go to fight government. I'm going to fight for you. I'm going to fight government to make your life better. So you're exactly right. We bear a tremendous responsibility for that, for which you don't even have to try me. I'll just confess and you can convict me. Now you have to decide whether you're going to sit around and think, yeah, okay, God, or you're going to try to help fix it. I mean, I'm not going to argue with you that we don't bear a tremendous responsibility for it and it's not our fault. Okay, but just like I said about Judge Garland, we got to put all that behind us now, and it's too late in the day for us to sit around and argue about what was. We can argue about that when we've fixed things. But you're right.
It's hard to put the broken egg back together.
Absolutely. That's what I said. We got to get them back in the box.
Jack's got a question, then we have time for one more. I see a hand over here, but if there's somebody who hasn't asked a question, we'll go with them first. If not, you've got the last word.
Hi. So we know that Trump received less votes than Mitt Romney did in 2012. However, the media likes to paint his candidacy as invigorating voters that politics had forgotten. Mm-hmm. So in light of this, is the problem with Trump invigorating these neo-fascists, or is the problem with Democrats not being able to put up a candidate that can challenge Trump despite Trump pulling, below expected numbers when it comes to the popular vote? Yes.
Yes. I think that Trump did invigorate. What had happened, like I said, people felt threatened by the pace and nature of events, and it motivated them. White identity. I really don't want to lay too hard on the racist thing as much as it is kind of a cultural thing. You were always rubbing my face in it. You were always telling me I was dumb. You were always telling me you were smarter than me. You were making me do stuff I didn't want to do and stuff I didn't think we needed to do. And so you made me mad. Now I'm mad, and guess what? I'm like a dog that kills a chicken. That was easy. I'll kill another chicken. I like killing chickens. So, yeah, he invigorated Republicans who don't traditionally vote, and it would be a mistake to underestimate the importance of that. And yes, y'all took things for granted and didn't go to the polls. You fielded, whatever you think of her merits, a bad candidate from a political perspective to post up against Donald Trump, and she lost.
And I'll just point out that Barack Obama also energized some voters who had not traditionally voted in the Democratic Party. So this can work on both sides. And the challenge is to find somebody who can do that on the other side. I think we have the last question here. Sorry, Annette.
Well, I know we've got a thing. We're going to have one last question here, and then this nice lady gets the last question.
All right. That's fine with me.
I told you to keep that microphone. You just gave it to her. Go ahead.
Well, we can talk about public policy, or we can talk about how my muscles are shrinking. To do things, I'm saying, versus talk about them. I want to put out the point that I think we take some things way too casually. And the thing that leads us there is ownership and responsibility. But I'll say this, and we can easily point the finger, but I'll say this. Does anybody in this room have a file on their brother like I have?
A file on their brother? A file
on my brother. What I'm saying here is casually we take a lot of our relationships verbally. We don't think about a lot of things, including politics. We don't do values clarification. We aren't habituated to really looking at our own values and how we live them out. So I'm saying casually, if you don't lock in and do formal work on something, you can really miss the boat. You can be led. by old thoughts. You can be led by newspaper news. You can be led by not doing all your homework. I'm just arguing that in terms of politics, a lot of people don't do their homework on who they're voting for. I'm saying maybe there's 12 candidates and you don't even do homework on 3.
Well, I think that's right. I don't have a file on my brother. He is not a right-wing populist. He's not a neo-fascist, but basically out of Hillary hatred, damn if he didn't vote for Obama. And my brother voted for, Trump. And I can't talk to him.
Voted for Obama?
No, I can't talk to him. We were telling stories at lunch about him. He's maybe the toughest man I've ever met in my life, and I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. So if I wanted to examine him about his values, he'd ask me to step outside. So I may have to let that ride. I know what you're saying, but it's kind of like my position on abortion's been for like 30 years, actually. People ask me, what's your position on abortion? And I'll say, well, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to stop talking about it. Don't talk to me about it anymore. I don't want to hear anything more about it. That's what my brother would say if I tried to evaluate his values. If he didn't, like I said, beat me like a rented mule. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your thoughts. And to go back to this concept of the great political divide, how do we speak to people who don't agree? It seems we're all in separate political bubbles. And the basics of that is what influences us, the media that influences us. And I must say that I was speaking to somebody recently who had totally different values and ideas about Trump. And I could tell that they listened to Fox News.
Yeah.
And I don't listen to Fox News. I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe. How do we get across that divide?
Well, this thing about alternative truths and alternative universes from which people get their information is a real problem, and we have to keep pushing through on it and fighting against that. I mean, we've got to. You can't just. I said you can't convince a Bannon or a Bircher. You got to try. You can't just say, give it up. And how do we reach them? How do we talk to people about that? I'll name some senator I don't know anything about that I think is pretty liberal as a Democrat, Sherrod Brown. Mm-hmm. How about he stands up on the floor of the Senate and says to his colleagues and to America, I do not agree with Neil Gorsuch on these things. He's not the man I would have nominated if I were president of the United States. But and I don't like the way Merrick Garland was treated. But I think we can be better than that. And I'm going to start now, and I'm going to vote for Neil Gorsuch because the President of the United States nominated him.
Or because he's qualified.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I should have said, because he's qualified. I don't agree with him, but he's qualified. We just got to stop this dying on every hill. I'm sorry, I'm running on here.
Well, we'd like to thank all of you for coming today. I think you can agree that we had a really stimulating speaker. High school was not quite like this, but I'm glad that Mac was able to come, and I'm glad that you all were able to come as well. Thank you.
Yeah, things are better. And when I was 14 in the 9th grade with Peggy, I got arrested 3 times, so things have picked up since then.